So, for example, right now, if you want to go create a new field, you go click the button that says create a new field, and it prompts you with a select list of every possible field type. And it can be really hard to kind of differentiate between all those things and understand what they might mean. And also, you might not even realize that it's a very long select list and there are many options. You have to scroll all the way to the bottom to find them all. And that's kind of overwhelming. And, knowing whether or not, if you want a list of numbers, you can't just stop it where it says number. You have to go find the list section and find that. And when you're looking at that, you have to decide whether you want an integer or a decimal or a float. And good luck knowing whether or not you actually want a decimal or a float, because they're different, but in very subtle ways. The same thing, which goes back to my original, Drupal days, is what kind of date field do I actually want? Do I want a timestamp? Do I want it to be ISO 60, whatever it is? And so the new UI presents a bunch of cards that are the categories or kind of grouped together of the different fields. And then once you select one of those categories, like number or date, it gives you the options below that with a description of what they are and why you might want to use them. So it takes it from the most unfriendly select list in Drupal core to one of the most helpful, visually, delightful experiences in Drupal core. That's the first step. The second part is that there are about 3 screens you have to click through when you're adding a field to get to the end process. You have to know whether or not the settings are applied, if you want it to be required, if you want to have multiple values, if you want to have sort of like validation, like for numbers, like the minimum or maximum or default value. And those are spread over different forms, and it's not clear why they're on different forms. The other problem is as you click through each step, those changes are going live to your site. I mean, obviously, if you're on prod, that's a huge problem. But even if you're on staging, it can be confusing to have these new fields created. So the new flow will save all the changes or delay all the changes until the very last step and save them all at the same time. And we'll combine all those kind of confusingly separate forms into a single form, as it was in the Drupal 7 days. So all those things are on target for Drupal 10.2.
I want to say it took me so long. Actually, I don't want to say how long it took me to realize that one of those forms were the things that were for this specific instance of the field.
Yes.
The other was for the base field.
Yes. The field storage itself that's shared
Yeah.
across all bundles. Yep.
Although
that was not true in those concepts existed in Drupal 7, but they were not presented in a confusingly separate way until Drupal 8, which is when we just changed the forms to match to the way it's stored in code, like in config rather. And we don't need to show off how it's stored in config to the end user. They don't need to know those things.
I will say, once I finally realized that, I do like that, because it, like, you just know, like if you're editing something, if you're changing it, but it's a much better workflow to have them in one form.
Yeah, it'll still be very clear which ones are which.
Yeah.
I think the biggest example of why when it can be frustrating right now is if you want to change an entity reference, and this is obviously if you don't have any content in it, because you can't really change too much about things once they're started to be the fields are in use. Let's say you set up an entity reference to users, and then later you want to go change it to, or the other way, from nodes first, right? Then you want to change it to users or back and forth. Which bundles you select, so like I wanted to point to articles or recipes or whatever, is on one form, and the fact that it's pointing to nodes or comments or taxonomy terms is on a different form. And then how it's actually then selected by the user, whether it's just the list of them or it's using a view, that's in a different place. And all those things are going to be unified now.
You know what would be my favorite change, if it was possible too, is if you could say something like, especially for entity reference forms, if you could say, hey, the bundles it points to are locked. They should be part of the base storage, right? Because a lot of times when you have an entity reference field, if you're reusing it, you want them to be the same everywhere. I mean, there's cases where you do want it to be the same field but different references. But most sites that I work on, if I'm reusing an entity reference field, I want it to point to the exact same bundles. And if you add a new bundle type, having to edit every single instance of that field, you have to remember, that it's everywhere, and
I think
every instance.
That's a modification that could be made. The other thing we did work on a lot is the reuse flow. Right. Previously, the reuse field was buried under the create a new field as a separate select list, which gave you no context of where those fields were used, and how they were set up. And now when you click, there's a separate button at the top level now that will say reuse a field, and it'll give you a table of all the fields that are available, what bundles they're
Ooh.
used on, the basic, high level settings. I think the thing that you had noticed that's in 10.1 right now is in the list of fields on a content type, if it's an entity reference or if it's other kinds of specific subfields like field types, will give you more metadata about how it's configured. It'll say not just any reference, but what it's pointing to.
Yeah.
And it gives you that information in that table.
That,
So I
that
think that reuse experience is improved similarly.
that is the thing I noticed, and I have to say my favorite thing, and then I think we can move on to the next thing. But my favorite thing about that is it's one of those changes I never thought about. It was
Yes.
one of those things that annoyed me about Drupal core, but I never realized, and then it was just fixed. So
Yeah.
so
I,
like
I
so
wanted to say that
so
that's the power of doing the user interviews. We conducted. I mean, Lowry did a majority of them, but many people worked on the user interviews, both conducting them and then kind of collating the observations. But that was one thing that stuck out. It was like, yeah, this is annoying, and this could be better. And it was the least invasive change I think we could have possibly made. And it was, it's going to be better for everyone who ever hits that page, but also for the long time users, it is something that's good enough that you notice it
yeah.
and feel appreciative of it. So the user interviews it's always painful to have to sit there and watch someone pick apart a UI that you've just, dealt with and learned your entire life. And it's like, well, that's how it is. That's just how it is, blah, blah, blah. But like
Yeah.
being able to make changes and improve those things is really, really kind of gratifying.
It's interesting to hear you talk about it because I think a lot of times Drupal's come so far from its roots, and its roots were very like developer centric, and a lot of the UI UX patterns you see are very developer centric. And I think that this is probably a holdover from that, and now
Absolutely.
it's being revamped in a way that's more quote unquote user friendly, right?
I will say when we pitched that we wanted to work on this with internally at Acquia, I was pointing out it is the oldest untouched UI in Drupal core.
Oh wow.
It effectively hasn't changed since CCK, which is the first module I ever used. And yeah, it really needed that, and it needed us to uproot those sort of long held just this is how we do things. I think the other biggest thing I wanted to point out was that I think the nice thing about doing user interviews that way are these are little things that no one would ever really file a bug report for. It's not a bug, it's just how it is. But the improvement, it benefits so many people. I think having that ability to say this is bad without having to come up with a solution yourself is really powerful. That can be, it usually doesn't really go that far in Drupal. If you drop a bug report and you don't have any good suggestions on how to fix it, it might not get the same amount of attention. So I think doing these user interviews has been a really powerful way to get these little things fixed.
I won't go into my tirade about non-code contribution and how it's very important and how UX folks should look at the UX of Drupal and put in feature requests to improve it where they see issues. But maybe I just did go into my tirade and just an abridged version.
And that's what we're doing.
There you go.
It's been great.
I concur. I think it's all great. It's all great. And I look forward to 10.2 and 11 and 12 and the future. Speaking of the future,